Maya Lee ran a small cafe in a bustling downtown district, barely keeping the lights on as inflation hit small businesses hard. One cold winter morning, a disheveled man in a tattered coat stumbled in, clearly hungry and unable to pay. Despite her mounting debts, she welcomed him with a hot meal. Hours later, what he left behind wasn't cash or a simple thank you. It was a handwritten message that would transform her struggling cafe into something she never dreamed possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Lee had poured her heart into the Morning Light Cafe for the past 3 years. Nestled between towering office buildings, her cafe was a cozy escape from the concrete jungle, with just 6 tables and a rustic wooden counter. Vintage coffee posters and local artwork adorned the exposed brick walls, while potted herbs lined the windowsills, adding fresh ingredients to her homemade dishes. The morning sunlight would filter through the large front windows, casting warm patterns on the reclaimed wood floors she'd carefully restored herself. Every morning at 3:30 a.m., Maya would unlock the cafe's door, the street still dark and quiet. She'd start preparing everything from scratch, kneading dough for fresh pastries, brewing the day's first batch of coffee, and preparing her signature soups using recipes passed down from her grandmother, May Wong. The smell of fresh-baked bread and brewing coffee would slowly fill the small space as she worked alone, having recently let go of her part-time helper to cut costs. The quiet morning hours were both her solace and her burden, a reminder of both her dreams and her struggles. The post-pandemic economy had hit small businesses particularly hard. Corporate workers who once filled her cafe during lunch hours now mostly worked from home. Food delivery apps took a huge cut of her already thin margins, and the rising cost of ingredients ate into what little profit she made. Maya stared at the stack of unpaid bills on her counter after closing time, her hands shaking as she counted the day's earnings for the 3rd time. The electricity bill was marked "Final Notice" in bold red letters, and her supplier had started requiring payment up front for deliveries. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister Emily, asking about next month's rent for their shared apartment. Maya's stomach tightened. She was already 2 months behind on the cafe's utility bills. At 32, she had invested everything into this dream, including her entire inheritance from her grandmother. The thought of losing it all made her chest tighten. She'd have to tell Emily soon that she'd been using their rent money to keep the cafe afloat, a confession she'd been avoiding for weeks. The weather forecast on her phone showed a winter storm approaching. Snow meant even fewer customers walking in. Maya looked at the family photo on her counter. Her late grandmother May smiling proudly at the cafe's opening day, Emily beaming beside them. She couldn't bear to tell Emily how bad things had gotten. The cafe had been more than just a business venture. It was a tribute to her grandmother's legacy, a way to keep her memory and recipes alive in a modern world that seemed to be leaving small, family-owned businesses behind. That evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Maya started preparing to close early. The street outside was almost empty, streetlights casting long shadows through the frosted windows. The winter wind whistled through the old building's frame, and Maya pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. She had just turned down the lights and was wiping down the counter when she heard the bell above the door chime, its familiar ring echoing through the quiet space. The sound that had once brought hope of a customer now filled her with dread, another mouth to feed when she could barely keep her own business alive. Looking up, Maya saw a figure standing in the doorway, snowflakes swirling around him as the door slowly closed behind him. The man's coat was worn thin, his shoulders dusted with snow, and his eyes held a weariness that Maya recognized all too well, the look of someone carrying the weight of their world on their shoulders. The man stood hesitantly by the door, water dripping from his threadbare coat onto the polished floor. Maya noticed his hands, once well-manicured, now rough and red from the cold. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something dignified in his bearing, a ghost of former prosperity that the current hardships couldn't quite erase. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected refinement. "I know you're closing, but she thought about her own situation, the unpaid bills." He paused, visibly struggling with his next words. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. His eyes darted to the floor, shame evident in his stance. Maya recognized the coat he wore, a once expensive Burberry, now worn at the edges and missing buttons. It reminded her of the businessmen who used to frequent her cafe before everything changed. But this man's coat told a different story, one of dramatic reversal of fortune. Emily's text about rent, the dwindling supplies in her kitchen. Every business instinct screamed at her to apologize, to explain that she was closed, to protect what little she had left. But something else stirred in her memory. Her grandmother May's voice, clear as day, sharing words of wisdom in their old kitchen. In our darkest times, May had told her, kindness is not a luxury we give up. It's the necessity that saves us. Those words had come during their own struggles, when May had kept their family restaurant open during the financial crisis, feeding those who couldn't pay, believing that karma would find its way back. Maya walked over to the door and turned the sign back to open. The man started to protest, but she held up her hand. Please sit down. The soup's still hot. She guided him to a corner table, the one her grandmother used to call the lucky table, where the afternoon sun would linger the longest. The kitchen was still warm as Maya fired up the stove again. She had some leftover dough from the morning and quickly worked it into her grandmother's special milk bread recipe. As she worked, she could see the man through the kitchen window, sitting perfectly straight in his chair, his dignity intact despite his circumstances. She decided to make her grandmother's special winter soup, a rich bone broth that had sustained their family through countless cold nights. And the recipe was complex, with herbs and spices that May had taught her to balance just so. Food is medicine for both body and soul, May always said. Maya added extra ginger and garlic, noting how the man had been shivering. While the soup simmered, she brewed a pot of her premium oolong tea, the kind she usually saved for special occasions. The familiar ritual of preparing the tea set helped calm her racing thoughts about bills and rent. For these moments, at least she could focus on something she knew how to do well, taking care of someone who needed it. The bread was just turning golden in the oven when she noticed the man had taken out a small notebook. He wrote slowly, deliberately, occasionally looking around the cafe with what seemed like professional interest. Maya recognized that look. She'd seen it on the faces of business consultants who used to frequent her cafe in better times. When everything was ready, Maya arranged the meal carefully on her best tray, the hand-painted one May had given her when she first opened the cafe. The soup steamed invitingly in her grandmother's blue and white bowl, the fresh bread arranged on a wooden board alongside, and the tea service complete with a small pot of honey. As she carried the tray out, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked tired, worried, exactly like her grandmother had in that old photograph from their family restaurant's hardest times. But May had survived those days, her kindness intact, her spirit unbroken. Maya straightened her shoulders and managed a genuine smile as she approached the table. The man looked up from his notebook, his eyes widening at the spread before him. This is too much, he protested weakly. But Maya could see his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the spoon. The aroma of the soup filled the air between them, carrying with it memories of warmth and better days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The warmth of the cafe couldn't quite mask the evening's deepening chill as Maya watched her unexpected guest eat. Each spoonful seemed to restore something in him, not just physical strength, but a dignity that had been weathered by circumstance. She noticed how he held the spoon with practiced elegance, how he dabbed his mouth with a napkin between bites, small habits that spoke of a different life. The steam from the soup created a gentle haze around him, softening the harsh fluorescent light from outside. "This soup," he said, his voice steadier now. "There's something familiar about it, Chinese herbs, but with a modern twist." His knowledge of cuisine surprised her. The balance of warming spices, ginger, star anise, but also something else I can't quite place. The depth of flavor reminds me of a restaurant I once consulted for in Shanghai. Maya smiled, impressed by his palate. White pepper and a touch of safflower. My grandmother's secret ingredient. She believed in bridging traditional and modern flavors. She found herself sharing how May had adapted her recipes over the years, adjusting them for changing tastes while maintaining their essence. She always said that food should tell a story, but it shouldn't be stuck in the past. The man, who introduced himself as James, listened intently, nodding with understanding that seemed to come from deep professional knowledge. His words came slowly at first, like a frozen stream beginning to thaw. He had been a restaurant consultant for 20 years, he explained, specializing in turning struggling establishments into successful brands. His portfolio had included some of the city's most renowned restaurants, and his reputation had once opened doors throughout the industry. But then everything changed. The recession had hit his industry hard. Companies cut their consulting budgets, longtime clients closed their doors, and then his wife's medical bills had drained their savings. "Cancer," he said quietly, twisting the gold wedding band that still encircled his finger. "We tried everything, spent everything. After she passed, I couldn't keep up with the mortgage, the medical bills, any of it. 6 months ago, I had an office on the 30th floor of that building," he gestured toward the window, to one of the gleaming towers that shadowed Maya's cafe. "Now I can't even afford a cup of coffee." He laughed, but there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of wondering at life's twists. It's strange how quickly things can change. One day, you're advising restaurant owners on their business strategy. The next, you're wondering where your next meal will come from. Maya found herself sharing her own story, too, how she'd left a promising career in finance to open the cafe, inspired by her grandmother's legacy. She described the early days of excitement and possibility, when the cafe had been full of regular customers who became like family. Then came the pandemic's isolation, followed by inflation's slow squeeze. Now she was facing the possibility of losing everything she'd built, watching her grandmother's dream slip through her fingers. "The irony," she said, pouring more tea into the delicate cups her grandmother had brought from Hong Kong, "is that my grandmother faced similar challenges. During the financial crisis, she kept our family restaurant open, often feeding people who couldn't pay. She always said that when times are hardest, that's when kindness matters most. I used to think it was just a nice saying, but now I understand what she meant." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your grandmother was wise. In my consulting work, I've seen hundreds of restaurants, from small family operations to major chains. But the ones that truly last, they have something more than just good food or smart business practices. They have hearts. They understand that a restaurant isn't just about feeding people, it's about creating a space where people feel valued." The conversation flowed easily as the evening deepened. James spoke about the restaurant industry's evolution, sharing insights from his years of experience. He talked about emerging trends, about how successful establishments were adapting to the new economic reality. His knowledge was comprehensive and current, despite his circumstances. And Maya found herself taking mental notes, recognizing the value in his casual observations. As they talked, Maya noticed James studying the cafe's layout, his eyes moving with professional assessment over the space. He asked thoughtful questions about her operations, her menu planning, and her customer base. His queries were specific, informed by obvious expertise, but also genuinely curious about her vision for the place. She could see the consultant he had been, emerging through the layers of hardship. "You know," he said, breaking off a piece of bread, "this location has potential you haven't tapped yet. The morning light here is extraordinary. I can see why you named it that. But have you considered how to maximize your space during different times of day? The way the light changes, the flow of foot traffic, it could all be working harder for you." Maya leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" James began sketching on his notebook, explaining how simple adjustments to seating arrangements could create different atmospheres throughout the day. His hands moved confidently across the paper, drawing quick diagrams. She watched as he mapped out possibilities she'd never considered, his expertise flowing naturally despite his current circumstances. The clock on the wall showed nearly 2 hours had passed. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the street hushed and white. James looked at the time and stood up slowly, gathering his dignity around him like his worn coat. The movement seemed to remind him of his current reality, and his confidence wavered visibly. "I can't pay you for this meal," he said quietly, "but I want you to know what it meant. Not just the food, but the way you served it. With respect, with care. That's rare these days, especially for someone in my situation." Maya started to say it was nothing, but James was already writing something in his notebook. She watched as he filled nearly a full page with his neat professional handwriting. He tore out the page carefully, folded it, and placed it on the table. "Please," he said, his voice carrying both authority and gratitude, "read this after I leave. And thank you truly for reminding me of what this industry can be at its best." He straightened his coat and walked to the door, his steps steady now. The bell chimed one last time, and he was gone, leaving Maya alone with the folded paper on the table. Maya stared at the folded paper on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. The cafe felt different now, quieter, more expectant. The overhead lights cast soft shadows on the weathered wooden table where James had sat, the empty soup bowl still steaming faintly in the winter air. She unfolded the paper carefully, noting the precise handwriting that filled the page. The letterhead caught her eye first. James Reynolds, Restaurant Industry Consultant. Below it was an email address at one of the city's most prestigious consulting firms, crossed out with a single neat line, and a personal email written below. "Dear Maya," the note began, "what you've given me tonight goes beyond a meal. You've reminded me of what makes this industry special, the power of food and kindness to restore dignity. Your cafe has something rare, authenticity, but it also has untapped potential that I believe could secure its future." Maya's heart began to race as she read further. James outlined a detailed analysis of her cafe's strengths and opportunities, drawing on his 2 decades of experience. He noted the prime location, the quality of her food, and most importantly, the genuine warmth of her service. But he also identified areas for improvement: the underutilized evening hours, the potential for catering services, the need for a stronger social media presence. The next paragraph made her sit down heavily in the chair James had vacated. "I maintain connections with several restaurant industry investors who focus on preserving and scaling authentic family establishments. Your cafe represents exactly the kind of business they look for. One with heart, history, and untapped potential." Her hands shook as she read about the investors he named. She recognized some of them from business magazines, successful restaurateurs who had built empires while maintaining the integrity of small, family-owned establishments. James offered to make introductions, providing their contact information and brief notes about their investment approaches. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to her eyes. "Your grandmother's spirit lives in every aspect of this place, not just in the recipes, but in the kindness you showed a stranger tonight. In my years of consulting, I've learned that success in this industry isn't just about numbers. It's about creating spaces where people feel welcomed, valued, and well-fed. You already have that foundation. With the right support and strategy, the Morning Light Cafe could become a beacon for others, proving that compassion and commerce can coexist." Maya read the note 3 times, her mind racing with possibilities. The names James had mentioned were legitimate. She'd read about their successful restaurant groups in industry publications. Their approach aligned with her values, preserving the soul of family restaurants while helping them thrive in the modern market. She looked around her cafe with new eyes, seeing it as James had described, not just as a struggling business, but as a space with untapped potential. The exposed brick walls could tell a story, the vintage posters could become part of a brand narrative, and her grandmother's recipes could reach more people while maintaining their authenticity. The winter wind rattled the windows as Maya carefully folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket. She began her closing routine, wiping tables, stacking chairs, counting the register. But her movements were different now, more purposeful. Each task felt less like maintenance and more like preparation for something bigger. As she locked up that night, the snow crunching under her boots, Maya thought about her grandmother's words again. When times are hardest, that's when kindness matters most. Perhaps May had known something Maya was just beginning to understand. That kindness wasn't just about giving, but about creating connections that could transform lives in unexpected ways. Back in her apartment, Maya stayed up late into the night researching the investors James had mentioned. Their track record was impressive. They had helped dozens of family-owned restaurants expand while preserving their unique character. One group had specifically focused on Asian American establishments, helping traditional recipes find new audiences while maintaining their authenticity. She drafted an email to the address James had provided, her fingers hovering over the send button as doubt crept in. Was this too good to be true? But then she remembered the way James had analyzed her space, his professional insight showing through despite his circumstances. His note hadn't just offered help, it had provided a detailed roadmap for her cafe's potential future. Maya hit send just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the city skyline. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. She set her alarm for 3:30 a.m., knowing that whatever happened next, she would face it with the same spirit of kindness and determination that had guided her grandmother, and now her, through their darkest times. The next morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Maya's normal pre-dawn routine felt different as she unlocked the cafe door at 3:30 a.m. Her phone showed no response to her late-night email, but she refused to let doubt creep in. Instead, she channeled her energy into preparation, determined to make every detail perfect. As she kneaded dough for the morning's pastries, Maya found herself implementing small changes James had suggested. She rearranged the counter display to catch the early morning light better, adjusted table positions to create more intimate spaces, and even experimented with a new presentation for her grandmother's recipes. The morning rush brought its usual parade of regulars. Mr. Chen from the law firm next door noticed the changed layout immediately. "Something's different today," he said, looking around appreciatively. "The space feels bigger somehow." Maya smiled, remembering James's words about maximizing space flow. By midday, her phone buzzed with an email notification. Her heart skipped as she saw the sender, Victoria Montgomery, one of the investors James had mentioned. The message was brief but promising. Intrigued by James's recommendation. Would like to see the space in person. Available tomorrow afternoon. Maya read the email 5 times, her hands trembling. Victoria Montgomery wasn't just any investor. She was known for transforming family restaurants into successful chains while preserving their authentic character. Her restaurant group had been featured in Forbes for their unique approach to scaling without sacrificing quality. The afternoon lull gave Maya time to research Victoria more thoroughly. Each article painted a picture of an investor who valued authenticity above quick profits. One piece described how she had helped a Vietnamese family restaurant expand to 5 locations while keeping the original recipes intact. Another detailed her commitment to maintaining the cultural integrity of the establishments she invested in. As Maya cleaned and prepared for the evening service, her mind raced with possibilities. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe book, its pages worn and stained with years of use. Each recipe told a story, not just of ingredients and techniques, but of May's journey from Hong Kong to America, of dreams passed down through generations. The cafe's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Emily. "Maya, are you okay? You haven't answered my texts about the rent." The concern in her sister's voice made Maya's stomach twist. She hadn't told Emily about James or the potential investor yet. It felt too fragile, too full of possibility to share. "Actually, Em," Maya said, taking a deep breath. "Something happened last night. Can you come by the cafe after closing? There's something I need to tell you." She heard the hesitation in her sister's voice, probably expecting bad news before Emily agreed to come by. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and preparations. Maya found herself looking at each detail of her cafe through Victoria's potential eyes. The vintage posters that had seemed charming now looked slightly faded. The menu board could use updating. The lighting in the evening hours needed work, just as James had pointed out. Emily arrived just as Maya was turning the sign to closed. Her sister looked tired after her shift at the hospital, but her eyes were alert with concern. Maya led her to their usual table, the one by the window where they'd spent countless hours planning the cafe's opening 3 years ago. "Before you say anything," Emily started, "I want you to know that if you need to sell the cafe, it's okay. We can figure something out. Maybe it's time to—" Maya reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. "That's not it at all," she said, and began to tell the story of the previous night. As she spoke about James, about his note, about Victoria's email, she watched Emily's expression change from concern to cautious hope. "But Maya," Emily said when she finished, "what if Victoria wants to change everything? What if she wants to turn this into something grandmother wouldn't recognize?" Maya pulled out James's note and showed it to Emily. "Look at what he wrote about authenticity being our strength. And look up Victoria Montgomery. Every restaurant she's invested in has kept its soul. Maybe this is exactly what grandmother would want. Her recipes reaching more people. Her legacy growing stronger." As they talked late into the night, the sisters began to dream again, just as they had 3 years ago. But this time, their dreams were tempered with experience, with an understanding of both the challenges and opportunities ahead. Maya shared James' suggestions for the space, and Emily contributed ideas from her own observations as both a sister and a customer. The next day's meeting with Victoria loomed ahead, full of possibility and uncertainty. But as Maya finally locked up and walked home through the quiet streets, she felt stronger than she had in months. Whatever happened next, she knew she'd faced her crisis with kindness, just as her grandmother had taught her. And somehow, that kindness had opened a door she never expected. The morning of Victoria Montgomery's visit dawned clear and cold. Maya arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, at 3 a.m., wanting extra time to perfect every detail. She'd spent half the night reviewing James's notes, researching Victoria's previous investments, and refining her vision for the cafe's future. The morning prep took on new significance as Maya worked through her grandmother's recipes. Each dish needed to showcase not just flavor but potential. She prepared samples of her most popular items: the milk bread that sold out daily, the warming winter soup that had touched James's heart, and new fusion creations that honored tradition while embracing innovation. By noon, the cafe gleamed. Maya had enlisted Emily's help before her hospital shift, and together they'd polished every surface until it shone. The vintage posters seemed to glow in the winter sunlight, and the herb garden in the window looked particularly vibrant against the snow outside. The aroma of fresh-baked goods and simmering broths filled the air, creating the welcoming atmosphere her grandmother had always strived for. Victoria Montgomery arrived precisely at 2 p.m. during the quiet period between lunch and dinner service. She wasn't what Maya had expected. Instead of the sharp-suited investor she'd imagined, Victoria was a warm-faced woman in her 50s, dressed elegantly but comfortably in a cashmere sweater and wool pants. Her keen eyes, however, missed nothing as she surveyed the space. "James Reynolds has impeccable taste," Victoria said, accepting the cup of oolong tea Maya offered. "He rarely makes recommendations these days, but when he does, they're always worth my time." She settled into a corner table, the same one where James had sat, and pulled out a small notebook. For the next hour, Victoria asked questions that revealed her deep understanding of the restaurant industry. She wanted to know about Maya's suppliers, her pricing strategy, her customer demographics. But she also asked about the stories behind the recipes, about May's journey from Hong Kong, about Maya's vision for preserving her grandmother's legacy. "Tell me about your biggest challenge," Victoria said, sampling the winter soup. Her eyes widened slightly at the first spoonful, and Maya felt a flutter of hope. "Besides the financial pressure," Maya began, choosing her words carefully, "it's finding the balance between growth and authenticity. I want more people to experience these recipes, to feel the warmth and connection food can create. But I won't compromise on quality or the personal touch that makes this place special." Victoria nodded, making notes. That's exactly the kind of answer I look for. Too many owners focus solely on expansion. They forget that what makes a restaurant successful isn't just its food, it's its soul. She gestured around the cafe. You've maintained that here. I can feel your grandmother's influence in every detail. As they talked, Victoria shared her vision for businesses like Maya's. She believed in what she called mindful scaling, growing, without losing the essential character that made a place special. She described how other family restaurants in her portfolio had expanded while keeping their core values intact. I'm not interested in creating another soulless chain, Victoria explained, accepting a second cup of tea. What I see here is an opportunity to prove that tradition and progress can coexist. Your grandmother's recipes, your dedication to quality, your commitment to community, these aren't limitations, they're your strengths. The conversation turned to practical matters. Victoria outlined a potential investment structure that would allow Maya to maintain creative control while accessing the resources needed for growth. She envisioned starting with modest updates to the current location, then possibly expanding to a second location within a year. But first, Victoria said, pulling out her phone, I'd like to bring in some colleagues next week, people who share my philosophy about preserving family businesses. Would that be acceptable? Maya nodded, trying to contain her excitement. As Victoria made notes in her calendar, Maya noticed she was using the same type of notebook James had written in. The coincidence made her smile. These were people who appreciated the tangible, the traditional, even in a digital age. Before leaving, Victoria paused at the door. You know, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen hundreds of restaurants, but very few with this much potential. James was right about you. She smiled warmly. Your grandmother would be proud of how you've honored her legacy while building your own. After Victoria left, Maya sat at the corner table, overwhelmed by the possibilities ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cafe floor, and for a moment she could almost see her grandmother there, nodding in approval. The day's events felt like the beginning of something significant, not just for the cafe but for everyone who had believed in her dream. The week following Victoria's visit transformed the Morning Light Cafe into a hub of careful planning and quiet excitement. Each morning before dawn, Maya refined her systems and documented her processes, preparing for the upcoming meeting with Victoria's investment team. The corner table had become her command center after closing hours. Spread across its surface were her grandmother's recipe books, business projections, and the detailed notes James had left her. Victoria had emailed a list of items to prepare: financial records, supplier contracts, staff training procedures. Each request revealed the thorough approach that had made her investment group successful. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Emily, who had taken to dropping by between hospital shifts to help with preparations. Found more photos of grandmother's old restaurant in Hong Kong, the ones from before she came to America. You need to see these. The message triggered a memory of May telling stories about her first restaurant, a tiny place in Kowloon, where she'd learned to balance tradition with innovation. When Emily arrived that evening, she carried a dusty photo album they'd discovered in their mother's attic. The sisters sat at the counter, papers pushed aside as they pored over faded photographs. There was May, decades younger, but with the same determined smile, standing proud in her first kitchen. The images showed a small space not unlike Maya's cafe, with tables crowded together and steam rising from huge soup pots. Look at this, Emily said, pointing to a detail in one photo. Behind young May was a wall covered in handwritten notes, messages from customers expressing gratitude for meals and kindness during hard times. She kept every thank you note, just like you kept James's letter. Maya traced her finger over her grandmother's face in the photograph. She always said a restaurant was more than just a business, it was a place where stories came together. She looked around her own cafe, seeing it with new eyes. Maybe that's what Victoria saw too, not just the potential for profit, but the continuation of a legacy. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Victoria's team had requested a tasting menu that would showcase both traditional recipes and Maya's modern interpretations. She spent hours in the kitchen, refining each dish until it told the perfect story of her grandmother's journey, of her own innovations, of the bridge between past and future. Regular customers noticed the subtle changes. Mr. Chen commented on the new table arrangements James had suggested, which had created better flow through the space. Mrs. Park, who'd been coming in for morning coffee since opening day, appreciated the enhanced display of pastries that caught the early light. "It feels more intentional," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Like everything has a purpose." Late one evening, as Maya was testing a new presentation for her grandmother's soup dumplings, she received an unexpected visitor. James stood in the doorway, looking markedly different from their first encounter. His coat was pressed, his shoes polished, and he carried himself with renewed confidence. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, stepping inside. "I heard from Victoria about the upcoming meeting. I thought you might want some additional insights about the team you'll be presenting to." Maya quickly set up 2 places at what she now thought of as his table. As she served tea and her experimental dumplings, James shared detailed information about each member of Victoria's investment group. He knew their backgrounds, their approaches to restaurant development, their particular interests in preserving family businesses. Victoria's group doesn't invest in places to change them. They invest in places that already have something special and help them share it with a wider audience. "The key," he explained, sampling a dumpling with obvious appreciation, "is to show them not just what the cafe is now, but what it could become without losing its essence." As they talked, Maya realized how much had changed since that snowy evening when James had first walked in. She'd been ready to give up then, seeing only the mounting bills and dwindling customers. Now she was planning for a future that honored her grandmother's legacy while building something new. "You know," James said as the evening grew late, "I've been consulting with restaurants for most of my life, but it took losing everything to remind me why I fell in love with this industry in the first place. It's about more than food or profit. It's about creating spaces where people feel valued, where kindness matters as much as cuisine." Maya thought about the photograph of her grandmother's wall of thank you notes, about the connections that had brought her to this moment. A simple act of kindness, a handwritten note, a shared belief in the power of food to build bridges between past and future. Before leaving, James paused at the door. "Next week's meeting? You're more prepared than you know. Just remember, they're not just investing in a business. They're investing in your story, in your grandmother's legacy, in the kind of place that makes the world a little bit warmer, one meal at a time." The morning of the investment team meeting arrived with a crisp, sunlit dawn. Maya had spent the night in the cafe perfecting every detail. The space had been transformed, not with dramatic changes, but with subtle refinements that highlighted its inherent charm. The vintage posters had been reframed, the herb garden expanded, and the lighting adjusted to create intimate spaces while maintaining the warm, welcoming atmosphere. Victoria arrived first, leading a team of 4 others. Each carried themselves with the quiet confidence of success, but Maya noticed how they took in the cafe's details with genuine interest rather than clinical assessment. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the steam from fresh brewed coffee and newly baked pastries. "Maya," Victoria began, "before we start, I want my colleagues to experience the cafe as your regular customers do. Would you mind serving us as you would on any normal morning?" For the next hour, Maya presented a carefully curated selection of dishes. She started with her grandmother's traditional congee, enhanced with her own touch of seasonal ingredients. Next came the milk bread that had first impressed James, followed by modern fusion dishes that showcased her culinary creativity, while respecting traditional techniques. The investors took notes, but their questions revealed a deeper interest than just numbers and profits. They wanted to know about her sourcing of ingredients, her relationship with local suppliers, the stories behind each recipe. One investor, an elderly gentleman named Robert, was particularly moved by the winter soup. "This reminds me of my mother's cooking," he said, his voice soft with memory. "You don't find this kind of care in chain restaurants. This is what we need to preserve while helping you grow." The formal presentation began after the tasting. Maya had prepared extensive documentation, financial projections, expansion plans, staffing strategies. But what caught the team's attention was the photo album Emily had found. The images of their grandmother's restaurant in Hong Kong, especially the wall of thank you notes, sparked an animated discussion about the role of community in successful restaurants. "What we're seeing here," Victoria explained to her colleagues, "is more than just a cafe. It's a bridge between generations, between cultures. Maya has managed to create something rare, a space that honors tradition while embracing the future." The investment team shared their vision for expansion. They proposed a careful, phased approach. First, upgrading the current location while maintaining its essential character. Then, possibly opening a second location in the Arts District, where the combination of traditional recipes and modern presentation would find an appreciative audience. "We're not interested in rapid expansion," one team member explained. "What works here is the personal touch, the attention to detail. We want to help you grow without losing that." As the meeting progressed, Maya found herself sharing more personal stories about learning to cook at her grandmother's side, about the regulars who had become like family, about her dreams for preserving these traditions while making them accessible to new generations. The conversation turned to practical matters. The investment team outlined a structured approach to growth that would allow Maya to maintain creative control while accessing their resources and expertise. They discussed everything from kitchen equipment upgrades to staff training programs that would ensure consistency across future locations. "What impresses us most," Victoria said as the meeting drew to a close, "is how you've maintained quality and authenticity despite financial pressures. That's rare in this industry. We believe we can help you share this vision with a wider audience without compromising what makes it special." Before leaving, Robert, the elderly investor, pulled Maya aside. "You know," he said, "I've been in this business for 40 years. What you have here, it's not just about the food. It's about creating a space where people feel connected to something authentic. That's worth preserving." As the team gathered their things, Victoria handed Maya a formal proposal. "Take your time reviewing this," she said. "We want you to be completely comfortable with every aspect of the partnership." After they left, Maya sat at the corner table, James's table, and opened the proposal. The terms were more generous than she'd expected, with provisions specifically protecting her creative control and her grandmother's recipes. But what touched her most was a handwritten note from Victoria. "Your grandmother's legacy deserves to be shared. Let us help you tell her story to the world." Maya looked around her cafe, seeing both what it was and what it could become. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "Sometimes kindness opens doors we never knew existed." The transformation of the Morning Light Cafe began subtly at first. After carefully reviewing the investment proposal with Emily and her mother's old friend who practiced corporate law, Maya signed the agreement with Victoria's team. The initial changes focused on enhancing what already worked, while carefully modernizing what needed updating. The cafe remained open during the renovations, which were scheduled in phases to minimize disruption. The vintage posters were professionally restored and reframed, telling the story of her grandmother's journey from Hong Kong to America. The herb garden expanded into a living wall, bringing vibrant life to the exposed brick. New lighting was installed to create the perfect ambiance from dawn to dusk, just as James had suggested. The kitchen received state-of-the-art equipment, but Maya insisted on keeping her grandmother's well-seasoned woks and carefully maintained cast-iron pans. "Some flavors can't be recreated with new equipment," she explained to the renovation team. Victoria had supported this decision, understanding that such details contributed to the food's authenticity. Training new staff became Maya's primary focus. She developed detailed manuals for each of her grandmother's recipes, documenting not just ingredients and procedures, but the stories and traditions behind each dish. Every new hire spent their first week learning about May's legacy and the cafe's philosophy of treating each customer like family. James, now working as a consultant again through Victoria's connections, helped develop systems that would allow the cafe to grow while maintaining its soul. He understood better than most how to balance efficiency with authenticity, having experienced both success and hardship in the industry. The key, he explained during a staff training session, is to make every customer feel the same warmth Maya showed me that snowy evening. That's not something you can fake. It has to be part of your culture. The regulars noticed the changes but appreciated how the cafe's essence remained unchanged. Mr. Chen still had his usual corner table for his morning coffee, though now he could pay through a sleek new point-of-sale system. Mrs. Park still received her daily soup in the same beautiful bowls, though now they sat on elegant new tables. Emily, who had initially worried about losing their grandmother's legacy, found herself increasingly excited about the cafe's evolution. She helped Maya design a wall similar to the one in their grandmother's Hong Kong restaurant, where customers could leave their own notes of appreciation. The wall quickly filled with stories of first dates, business deals closed, friendships formed, all over Maya's food and hospitality. The financial results exceeded everyone's expectations. Word spread about the cafe that combined traditional recipes with modern presentation, where every dish came with a story and every customer felt like part of an extended family. Food critics began to take notice, praising the balance of innovation and tradition. Victoria's team proved true to their word about measured growth. They helped Maya refine her business model without pushing for rapid expansion. When they did discuss opening a second location, it was with careful consideration of how to maintain the same level of quality and personal touch. One evening, as Maya was closing up, she found James sitting at his usual corner table. He looked healthy and confident now, fully recovered from his earlier hardships. "You know," he said, sipping the same winter soup that had started everything, "some people thought I was crazy for making that introduction to Victoria. They said a small cafe like this couldn't scale without losing its soul." Maya looked around at her cafe, at the restored posters that told her family's story, at the wall of customer notes that echoed her grandmother's tradition, at the modern touches that complemented rather than overshadowed the cafe's heritage. "They didn't understand that soul isn't something you lose when you grow," she replied. "It's something you share." The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the photograph of May that now held pride of place near the entrance. Maya remembered her grandmother's words about kindness opening unexpected doors. That snowy evening when she'd served a meal to a stranger had opened more than just a door. It had revealed a path to preserving her grandmother's legacy while building her own. As she locked up that night, Maya noticed a new note on the customer wall. It was from a young woman who'd recently started working in one of the office buildings nearby. "This place reminds me of my own grandmother's cooking. Thank you for keeping traditions alive in such a beautiful way." Maya smiled, knowing that somewhere, May was smiling too. 1 year had passed since that snowy evening when James first walked into the Morning Light Cafe. Maya stood in the doorway of her second location, watching the early morning light stream through the windows. The new space, located in the city's bustling arts district, mirrored the original cafe's warmth while establishing its own character. The expansion had been thoughtful and measured, just as Victoria had promised. The second cafe featured the same exposed brick walls, herb gardens, and vintage posters telling her family's story. But it also had its own personality. Local artists' works hung alongside the historical photographs, and the menu included new fusion dishes that Maya had developed to honor both tradition and innovation. The training of the new location's staff had been intensive. Maya had personally taught each cook her grandmother's recipes, sharing not just techniques, but the stories behind each dish. The new team understood that they weren't just preparing food. They were continuing a legacy that stretched from a small kitchen in Hong Kong to 2 thriving cafes in their city. James, now fully re-established in his consulting career, had become a regular fixture at both locations. He helped Maya develop systems that maintained consistency while preserving the personal touch that made each cafe special. His own experience of hardship and recovery had given him a unique perspective on balancing growth with authenticity. The wall of customer notes, now a signature feature at both locations, continued to fill with stories. Maya made sure to read each one, often finding herself moved by how her grandmother's recipes had become part of so many people's lives. One recent note particularly touched her. "My daughter had her first date here last week. I had mine at the original location 20 years ago. Thank you for creating a place where memories are made." Victoria's investment group had proven to be true partners, respecting Maya's vision while providing the support needed for sustainable growth. They never pushed for rapid expansion, understanding that the cafe's success lay in its careful balance of tradition and progress. When discussions turned to possibly opening a third location, it was always with the same thoughtful approach that had guided the first expansion. Emily, who had initially feared the changes, now divided her time between her nursing career and helping Maya manage the cafe's operations. The sisters had found a rhythm that allowed them to honor their grandmother's legacy while building their own. They still started each day with early morning prep, just as they had in the beginning, but now they had a team of dedicated staff working alongside them. The original cafe had maintained its special place in the community. Regular customers like Mr. Chen and Mrs. Park still had their usual tables, and new customers continued to discover the warmth and authenticity that had made the cafe special from the start. The winter soup that had once restored James's dignity now warmed countless others, each bowl served with the same care and attention. On this particular morning, as Maya prepared for another day, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside, an elderly woman peering through the window with the same hesitation James had shown a year ago. Without hesitation, Maya opened the door early, inviting her in from the cold. As she prepared a bowl of soup for the woman, Maya thought about how one act of kindness had rippled outward, touching not just her life but the lives of so many others. Her grandmother's recipes had found a wider audience. Her philosophy of hospitality had influenced a new generation of staff, and her belief in the power of food to build community had proven true in ways she could never have imagined. The morning light filtered through the windows, catching the steam rising from the soup bowl. Maya served it with the same care she had shown James that snowy evening, understanding now more than ever her grandmother's words about kindness opening unexpected doors. The Morning Light Cafe had become more than just a business. It was a testament to the power of preserving tradition while embracing change, of maintaining soul while pursuing growth, of treating each customer like family even as the family grew larger. As the day began and customers started flowing in, Maya looked at the photograph of her grandmother that hung in both locations. May's smile seemed to hold a knowing wisdom, as if she had always understood that her legacy would grow beyond that small kitchen in Hong Kong, touching lives and creating connections in ways that transcended time and place. The Morning Light Cafe had become a bridge between past and future, between traditions and innovations, between strangers who became family, all because of one simple act of kindness on a snowy evening. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.